Hey everybody, welcome back to another week of Chasing Frets. I'm joined by my co-host Andy Ellis. How you doing, Andy?
I am doing well, thank you.
And this week's guest is Julian Lage, who's been a longtime buddy and one of our favorite guitar players. And we had so much fun with him this week. And today's topic is kind of based, and I go into this a little bit in the episode, kind of based on this piece he wrote for John Zorn's Arcana series of books. He had Julian write down 12 observations about guitar, and each one of these 12 has a little mini essay to go with it. And as soon as he sent it to me, Andy, I was like, I got to share this with you. And we were like, wow, this is really good stuff.
It is. And we get a chance to ask the author about a couple of these points. We don't go through all 12. That's up to you, dear listener, to pursue. But we open the can and dig right in on a couple of these. It's great.
Yeah, I would definitely recommend going and checking out this book and reading the full thing along with all the other pieces in this book. But what we do is we take a few of these 12 ideas that he wrote about in longer form and just have him touch on them, revisit them. And as you can hear in this episode, they're sure to lighten up your creativity and get you thinking about the guitar and about music in different ways. And I think that's the whole goal of everything in this series of books is they want you to view and hear and play music in different ways. Mm-hmm. So here's today's episode with Julian Lage. Today's episode of Chasing Frets is brought to you by Collings guitars, and more specifically their new 470JL that was designed in collaboration with Julian Lage. It's an entirely new hollow body design that Julian and the crew at Collings Guitars have been working on for years. It was designed from the ground up to have the feel, tonal range, and aesthetic qualities that were exciting to both Julian and the crew at Collings. The guitar features Ron Ellis Dynasonic pickups, a Bigsby B3 tremolo, and a unique trestle block construction that was developed by Collings. The 470JL will be released officially in January and will be available to order through authorized Collings dealers. So head on over to collingsguitars.com and check it out. Julian, thank you so much for joining us this week. You've been on my list since we first came up with this idea. You were near the top. I'm glad it all worked out.
Thanks, brother. It's a privilege, really, to be here with both of you. So thank you. Thanks for having me.
So I remember this is probably 4 or 5 years ago. You messaged me like, "Hey, I got something I want you to read," and you sent me over this PDF. And you didn't tell me anything really about it. You're like, "Hey, I wrote this piece for John Zorn." Mm-hmm. And you sent me this piece, and it was entitled 12 Observations for a Guitar. Mm-hmm. And it really made me super jealous because I'm like, man, I wish you would have written that piece for us. So what I want to do today is revisit some of those.
Okay.
And also point people. Now, this is an excerpt. This is a chapter in what would you call this? Like a journal he puts together?
Yeah, it's a collection of written pieces by contemporary musicians, largely improvising musicians, classical musicians. And as I understand it, the intention is to compile literature about music-making processes, processes that if someone found hundreds of years from now, they would kind of get a sense of what the community was up to in what is our present day.
And it's called Arcana.
Yeah.
And this is your piece that we're going to talk about, I believe, is in volume 8.
Is it? To be honest, there are so many volumes of this, and I've lost track. So I trust you.
When you talk about interesting things out of that book, another one that I think is like the chapter right after yours is Ava Mendoza.
Oh yeah,
where she interviews herself.
Yeah,
and it's so interesting how it's not just musicians espousing an essay about this or that, how the form of each piece is totally different from chapter to chapter. And even just that for me as a writer is pretty inspiring.
That's so cool. Yeah. It's a heavy contribution to the scene. You know, I mean that I can't tell you how many times I've talked to people, musicians, fellow musicians in New York and in the improvising scene who will reference some edition of that book, you know, and say, "Oh, did you ever see what Frizzell said and this one about that? Or did you see Guion Riley's thing about dreams or this person's philosophy of the overtone series?" It's kind of door number 3 for sharing musical education, That's not following one methodology. So it's extremely cool.
It's like a peer-reviewed journal for improvising musicians.
Yeah. I would agree with that.
So you had these 12 observations, and we're not going to go through all 12, but I want to pick out a couple to have you maybe unpack them a little bit, and then also maybe think about if your views have changed or how they have not since the time you've written this.
Fun. Yeah.
And one of the interesting things is, and I'm just going to give you the title of the observation and let you go from there, is guitar is designed to fall, so are you.
Right.
So tell me a little bit about what that means for somebody who might want to read about it more in the book.
Absolutely. So, that particular mini essay is really derived from the somatic experience of playing the guitar. And what I mean by that is, what's your physical experience of the instrument? And I started playing the guitar when I was very small, and the guitar was much bigger in relation to me than it is today. And so a lot of, I would say, tension, strategy, even like real tactics, came into play as a younger person because I didn't want to drop the guitar, right? I didn't want, it would be embarrassing. It would hurt the guitar. It would be, who knows what would happen. That's what was going through my head. So as I grew up and got taller, basically, I realized that there's probably a third of my energy going into just bracing the guitar into a fixed position, either on my lap or even when standing with a strap. So at some point I realized I was kind of operating at, a reduced capacity. I didn't feel free to move because I would go to turn and I think, well, no, you can't do that because now it's imbalanced. Can't do that. I might drop it. And at a certain point, I injured my left hand pretty severely playing guitar and lots of it. And one of the programs I followed to rehabilitate was to sit with the guitar in my lap and just kind of rock it to its, points of being imbalanced. In other words, if it was sitting squarely in my lap, I would rock it forward and find out exactly where the point of no return would be, where the guitar would just face plant. And I would go really slow, and I would just kind of let it fall. And then I would put it back in the middle. I'd do it to the side, find the point of no return where it would definitely tip off my lap. I would do it on a couch, or near pillows. And I would let it fall. And what I experienced was being in touch with that. I don't even want to say it's fragility because it's really not that fragile. Especially guitars are robust, and so are we for the most part. But just the delicacy of these kind of invisible limits of where we're supposed to not go with our bodies and with the guitar. Just investigating those was hugely helpful in my rehabilitation of this injury. Because all of a sudden I felt like, no, I'm a guitar player who's 5'11". I'm not a small little boy anymore. And the guitar is actually quite small, and I can move freer, and I don't have to work so hard. Subsequently, I'm less likely to be injured in the way I was when the injury went down. So that's what it means. Look at how the guitar falls. Look at you fall. And it gets a lot more nerdy than that in the article with regard to gravity and the relationship to it. But that's the gist of it.
It reminds me when you talked about finding balance with your human body in gravity and the earth, and you say it much more eloquently than I just did, but it reminds me of Tai Chi, and I'm studying, I try to incorporate some of the principles of Tai Chi into my playing today.
That's great.
And that idea that your skeletal structure and your muscular structure, if you learn to move with it and in harmony with it, that gravity is not your enemy, but gravity is actually the energy. It's not even a force, that you have to fight. It's an energy that you can use to your advantage moving through the world,
Absolutely. Oh, and Tai Chi and Qigong and those disciplines, those have been hugely influential in my life, especially when I was in my 20s, and I've just started returning to it because it gives you a very palpable connection to it. Yeah. And I also want to underline what you said about gravity not being not viewing it as this antagonistic force. I think we think of gravity as weighty, it pulls us down, and that's not really how it's kind of not really how it functions. Obviously, as a downward pull, but it meets whatever touches the earth with oppositional and equal force, right? So there's kind of the zero-sum game where it's the way you could see an object resting on the ground, right? If gravity were like kind of a bully or a jerk, it could throw that object at the ceiling, right? It could overpower it, but it's always equal. And the force it needs to hold the car up and the force it needs to hold you up are different, and they're calibrated. Hence, it's very mystical and wonderful. But there's another component to this too, which is that structurally speaking, instability is usually if you're talking about the anatomy of the body, where there's instability, there's usually support. And what I mean by that is, if you think of the head sits on the top of the spine, it's not going to fall off the top of your head, right? You know what I mean? It's kind of this big ball on a spine. Anatomically speaking, as soon as the head starts to lose its balance, all the musculature of the back is told to, hey, come and help this from falling over. And so the head has to keep falling, the body has to keep catching, the head has to keep falling, the body has to keep catching. That instability, to be in touch with that actually triggers like response mechanisms, has a direct relationship to improvised music too, right? Something kind of needs to go wrong for you to have some way to resolve it. And I say wrong in quotations, but I just mean something needs to spark a response. And usually it's instability, and it's giving up this sense that you're being pulled down into some unfortunate gravitational orb. So it's just good. And like, the thing with all these micro essays is they're just to get you thinking about it. I had gone through life never thinking any differently about how you hold a guitar. And I thought, I have to be strong, I have to be planted, and the guitar can't fall. Well, what you see when you see a lot of fellow guitarists is we have a lot of tight hips and our backs hurt, and the guitar hasn't fallen in 35 years, but we don't feel good. So you have to kind of recalibrate, I think is the way to look at it.
So Andy, what was one of your favorites off this list?
The 1 minute improvisational collection, which Julian obviously can describe much more clearly than I can. But once upon a time, long before either of you guys were even thought of, I studied with Mick Goodrick, and he had this same thing. It was in the early day of cassettes. This was 1969, 1970 when I studied with him. Wow. And so he was a proponent of listening to yourself, but I'm going to let Julian describe the exercise, because it's much more nuanced than just recording and playing back and listening to yourself.
Oh, that's so cool, though, Andy, that you, that you worked with Mick in that era, and yeah, it's true. Mick is a huge believer of that. Self-reflection, recording yourself, but with a strategy, So. In a nutshell, this particular exercise it comes from Aladdin Matthew, one of the great composers and teachers. Wrote several books, some in the spiritual musical realm, published by Shambhala. One called The Listening Book, very influential to me. The other is something called The Harmonic Experience, which is kind of a iconic work about polyrhythms and harmony. So he spans a wide breadth of the academic universe. He gave me a lesson years ago in which he basically said, go ahead and play something for me. And I was a teenager and I had no real background with improvised music, so to speak. I played jazz music and I played blues, but I didn't think of improvising as something you would do apart from a song, right? So I kind of said, well, what do you want me to play? He said, well, just improvise. And I said, yeah, but over what? He's like, no, that's the point. Just improvise. I said, oh, okay, whatever. And so I started playing something, played for a few minutes, and at the end of that few-minute piece, he said, okay, here's what you got to do. Clearly he saw the potential for me to get a lot better. And he said, you're going to get a tape recorder, and you're going to record, I want you to record 10 1-minute long improvised compositions per day. And just to clarify what that means is, at the time he was advising using a timer and a recorder as two separate mediums. Nowadays, if you have a phone, you can watch yourself how much time you've been playing on your recorder. That's sufficient. The deal is you're trying to score the 1 minute. So in other words, you don't play for a minute and stop. You play for a few seconds. You notice, okay, we're at 30. That's kind of, you could argue that's the bridge of the piece, right? So at 30 seconds, you have to kind of do some shift. At 45 seconds, you're doing something to bring it in for a landing. And by 58, 59 seconds, you're done. Ta-da, that's your piece, right? Now, that's the functional part of it. The kind of strategy is if you do 10 a day of these, right? His advice was you do 10 a day for a minimum of 7 days, and you don't listen to any of them until the 8th day. Right? So in a week, you've accumulated 70 minutes of you improvising guitar. Now for me, and I think I would imagine others, but I don't want to project, but definitely for me, that was impossible to imagine. If someone said, Julian, play for an hour and 10 minutes, improvise to make it authentic, and I'd be like, no, sorry, it's not going to happen. What's cool about it is the punchline to all of it is that on the 8th day, you sit down, you listen to all 70 minutes, right? When I did it the first time, I was blown away. I heard all this stuff that I never in a million years would have told you I did on the guitar. Like I play a lot of D drones, or I play like folk stuff, vocabulary. I never heard that in the rest of my life. You sit down with a piece of paper and you basically have 2 halves. On the left side, I should say, of the paper, you write down trends. These are things you notice. I play a lot of G chords. Oh, I use a lot of harmonics. Oh, I never use harmonics, right? It's really, they're observations. They're not loaded with any emotional charge. I guess if you say, wow, it's incredible, you can write that down, but it's not that productive to really be down on yourself. The right side of the page is the opposite in a way. It's forecasting. So in other words, you'd say, next time I do this, I would love to try more double stops. Next time I'd like to play faster. Next time I'd like bigger endings. Next time, it's a wish list. The genius part to me of Aladdin Matthews' kind of strategy with it is that, one, it gets you deeply in touch with the way you actually sound, but not in a martyrdom way. Like, okay, let's face it, I suck. Let's listen to it. It's not that at all. It's actually quite the opposite. It's like, it's amazing that you produce so much music, and wow. And then the second part is you can build a strategy for development that's based on what you do rather than applying things you've been told you should care about. I more often than not, a teacher's not going to come to you and say, thanks for coming to the lesson. By the way, just my personal agenda, you should use more double stops. No one cares about the student enough or it would be appropriate enough, I should say. It wouldn't be appropriate for a teacher to tell you what you should cultivate for your own style. Yeah. But you can do it. And this is a nice way to do it.
Mm. That's a good one. And as soon as I read that, I was like, I need to record myself. And I probably, in a way, I've caught myself doing a similar thing. Not as disciplined as the method you're talking about with chord progressions, especially if I'm collaborating with my band and we're writing a song and we're trying to figure out a chorus. I might play the verse, just strum the chords to the verse and keep trying to find, where's the chord for the chorus going to start at. You know what I mean?
Right.
And translating that to improvisation, even if you're not a jazz musician, it just kind of awakens the creativity muscles in your brain in a new way, which I think, again, is the whole goal of this whole list.
Absolutely. I mean, if there was like a 13th point to the list that never made it on there, I think it would address just the fact that I personally am trying to appeal to the music fan inside of me. So all efforts are to make music that I enjoy. I want to be a guitar player that I love. I want to be, I'm the only one who has a chance of making the thing that I specifically want to hear. And I sometimes think that through education, we can forget that pretty natively, if we didn't take a guitar lesson ever, we could verbalize what we like and don't like. We can say, yeah, Jeff Beck, awesome. Like that, whatever critical response mechanism is triggered when we hear things that we love and we don't, that's what we're looking to. That's the reference point we want to use for our own development. What happens, and I'll keep it brief, is that I feel that we kind of downplay our ability to know what we like and we don't like. We become neutral. Like, I guess I'm good. I guess I'm terrible. I don't really know. And a lot of these exercises in that big essay is just to get you in touch with, like, you know, or else you would never have bought a record in your life, or you never would have seen a movie or told a friend about a book you like. You know what you like, and so do that and drop the rest.
All right, we're going to touch on one more of these, Julian,
Please.
but I highly encourage everybody to go and check out this book and read all of these in-depth essays you've written, because I've gone back to them at least once every couple of months. I'll open the book and read something
that's so
here.
Cool.
Well,
Thanks.
the last one I want to, and first of all, you did steal my last question, because I was going to ask you what was the 13th thing on the list.
I'll come up with another one.
Okay. But for the last observation here I want to touch on is, once you play a note, it's too late. And me having read your essay several times, I kind of get the idea of what you're talking about there. But can you briefly describe the idea behind that phrase? Once you play a note, it's too late.
Absolutely. That's a good one. That's really good. Years ago, I studied with an incredible teacher in New York. Her name's Sophia Rosoff. And Sophia Rosoff at the time was in her mid-90s.
Wow.
And teaching nonstop and just incredible. And she had been teaching pretty steadily in New York since about 1940. And so she mostly worked with classical piano players, right? Her teacher was a woman named Abby Whiteside. Abby Whiteside wrote a very important book called Mastering the Chopin Etudes, and ostensibly introduced a notion about piano playing that was not about the micro individual, every finger matters kind of approach. It was broader. It was, how can you get in touch with what Abby and then Sophia would talk about as emotional rhythm of a piece. An emotional rhythm is kind of like if you took a melody or a song and you stripped all the pitches away. Obviously, we'd be left with syncopation or rhythm, but they're talking about the you'd be left with still the feeling of the song, even if you didn't have the pitches. And I always use the example, just to myself, when I forget it, is like if a car drove by your house right now and they're blasting Thriller by Michael Jackson, you wouldn't be able to hear the notes, but you would somehow triangulate, oh, they're playing Thriller, right? You just know it. So when I went to Sophia, she had me play a piece, and there's various techniques that Abby and Sophia developed. One of them is called splashing. It's really hip if you're into it. Just buy the book by Abby Whiteside and start getting into her teaching. But they're basically all techniques to get you to play the piece without notes. So on a piano, it could be, the splashing thing could be, you have a passage of 8 bars. You basically just throw your hands down on the piano in the rhythm and the tempo of the song and do it until the ear hears the notes that would have been played. It's a real subtle thing, but it's not so subtle. You know what I mean? So when I said, once you play the notes, it's too late, it kind of speaks to the fact that there's a lot of energy put into what I would kind of consider collateral damage, like kind of cleanup patrol of, you play something you didn't like and now you're vibrating it to make it more endearing, and now you're bending it to do, you're kind of like you're manipulating it
after the fact.
And if it worked, oh my God, it'd be great, right? That would be a foolproof way to get through a solo feeling good, because I can always fix it. But in reality, I think sometimes, in my experience, again, it's my own projection, right? It has nothing to do with anyone else. My experience has been such that once you play something, you'll learn more about what to do next if you sit with what happened, no matter how egregious it might feel. If you play a note and it was underpowered and undercommitted and kind of whatever, great. If you really process that that's what happened, my guess is something will drop in that tells you how to proceed to get that horsepower back, for example. Or it could be the inverse. Oh, I've played too much. This is a classic thing with myself as a guitar player. It's like, you play, it's not going well, you play more, it's really not going well, so you play a lot more, and then you're just depressed, right? So that comment about once you play the notes too late, it speaks to two factions. One is, don't try to fix something that happened, it's best to leave it. And it also speaks to this tradition from Abby Whiteside about emotional rhythm. And I highly encourage anyone who has the time and interest to look it up. It's very, very appropriate to the guitar.
Cool. Well, we're going to wrap up, Julian, by me re-asking you a question you've already kind of answered. Is that, let's say there's one more thing you need to add on this list based on your experiences since you wrote this list. What would number 13 be?
It's a great question. I mean, I frankly, I don't remember how all of them pieced together. I remember at the time feeling like there was a sense that if you did all of these, you would kind of, I mean, it sounds almost silly to say, but you would almost figure out what the missing thing was. Like that was the intent. Like, what didn't I say? Now that this has encouraged you to enter a headspace, what hasn't been addressed? And I kind of stand by that. I think you have to figure out, what didn't I say? What do you still need after, and do that. I always think there's more to be said about tuning the guitar, you know. And frankly, I'm a bit ignorant about all the ways to do it, but I would love to be a little more explicit about that. I think there could be more to say about accompaniment, but again, it's very situational. So it was less appropriate for a master list. So to speak. So, you know, the best answer is you figure it out. And
yeah.
And I like that seems like what we're all up against anyway. So I'll roll with it.
All right, Julian. Well, thanks so much for hanging with us this week, man.
Pleasure. And, such a treat. Thank you guys.
We'll be back later this week with more from Julian Lage.